It was 6,047 in the morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I almost didn't answer it. I'd worked a double shift the night before, 12 hours on my feet at the hospital, then another 4 catching up on charting I'd fallen behind on. I was the kind of tired where your eyes hurt when you close them. So when I saw the number on the screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. It was the main line for Sunrise Ridge Memory Care, the facility where my grandmother had lived for the past 8 months. I picked up. "Is this Simone?" the woman on the other end asked. Her voice was careful, measured, the kind of careful that means something bad has already happened. "Yes," I said. I was already sitting up. "This is Carolyn, the night administrator at Sunrise Ridge. I'm calling because your grandmother, Mrs. Carolyn Adele Faulkner, was discharged from our facility approximately 40 minutes ago. We want to make sure she arrived safely." I didn't understand what she said at first. I actually made her repeat it. "Discharged," I said. "What do you mean discharged? By who?" There was a pause. A long one. "Her son authorized the discharge. He signed the paperwork last night and arranged transportation this morning. He listed your address as her destination." I walked to my front window. The porch light was on. The street was empty except for my neighbor's cat sitting on a car hood, 2 houses down. There was no one there. I told Carolyn there was no one at my address. I told her my grandmother was not here. I told her I had not spoken to my uncle in 6 weeks and that I absolutely did not know anything about a discharge. The silence on her end told me everything I needed to know about how bad the situation was. I was in my car in under 3 minutes. I drove every street between my house and the facility, which is about 2 miles of residential neighborhood, mostly quiet streets with wide sidewalks and older oak trees. It was the end of January. The temperature on my dashboard said 22 degrees. I found her 4 blocks from my house, standing on the corner of Meridian and Callaway, holding a plastic bag from Sunrise Ridge with the facility logo on it. She was wearing her good church coat, the navy wool one with the gold buttons, and her house slippers. No hat, no gloves. She didn't recognize me at first. That's the disease. Some mornings she knows exactly who I am and asks me about my job and tells me stories about her own years as a school teacher. Other mornings, she looks at me like I'm a stranger who means her no harm but is definitely in her way. That morning was the second kind. "Ma'am," I said, and I kept my voice soft. "My name is Simone. I'm your granddaughter. You're safe. Let's get you into the warm car." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't want to be a burden." I held it together long enough to get her into the passenger seat and turn the heat all the way up. Then I sat there in the driver's seat for about 30 seconds with my hands on the steering wheel, not moving, because I was trying very hard not to fall apart. My grandmother, Adele Faulkner, was 81 years old. She had spent 42 years teaching 4th grade in the Columbus City School District. She had raised 3 children largely on her own after my grandfather died of a heart attack in 1987. She had never once complained about any of it. She was the kind of woman who sent birthday cards 3 days early so they'd arrive on time. She kept a prayer journal. She made the best sweet potato pie I have ever tasted in my life, and I've been trying to recreate it for 6 years. She was standing on a street corner in 22-degree weather in her house slippers because my uncle had authorized her discharge from memory care at 6 in the morning and arranged for a car service to drop her at an address where she had never lived. I drove her to my apartment. I made her oatmeal with brown sugar, which she likes. I wrapped her in the quilt that lives on my couch. And then, once she was settled and warm and watching the morning news, I went into my bedroom and I made some calls. I want to be clear about the timeline here, because it matters. It matters a lot. My grandmother was moved into Sunrise Ridge Memory Care in May of the previous year. She had been diagnosed with early to moderate Alzheimer's 18 months before that, and after she left a pot boiling on the stove and forgot about it until the smoke alarm went off and a neighbor called 911, the family agreed that she needed more support than any of us could provide at home. I was in my 2nd year of nursing school at the time. I wanted her to move in with me. My uncle said that was impractical. My uncle, whose name I will get to, said he had researched facilities and found the best one in the area and that he would handle the financial arrangements. What I did not know, what none of us knew, or at least what I didn't know, was what those financial arrangements actually looked like. My grandmother owned her home outright, a 3-bedroom house in Westerville that she'd paid off in 2004. She had a pension from the school district, approximately $1,400 a month. She had Social Security, approximately $1,100 a month. She had a savings account that, when I last knew anything about it, held somewhere in the neighborhood of $90,000. That was the money she'd been setting aside since the 1990s, a little every month, money she called her just-in-case fund. Sunrise Ridge Memory Care costs $5,800 a month. That's the standard rate for a shared room. My grandmother had a private room, which runs $7,200. On paper, the math doesn't work forever, but it works for a while. Her income plus her savings could cover the facility for years. That's what I assumed was happening. I was wrong. After I got my grandmother settled that morning, the first call I made was to Sunrise Ridge. I asked them to walk me through the discharge paperwork. Carolyn was still on shift and she was, I think, genuinely disturbed by what had happened. She told me that my uncle, I will call him my uncle because that's what he is, had been listed as my grandmother's healthcare proxy and financial power of attorney since June, about a month after she entered the facility. He had signed discharge paperwork the previous evening authorizing her release effective 6 a.m. He had arranged a car service. He had listed my address as her destination. He had not called me. He had not texted me. He had not texted me. He had not left a voicemail. I asked Carolyn if the facility had any record of why the discharge was initiated. She paused. Then she said the account had been closed due to non-payment. My grandmother's room had been unpaid for the past 2 months. The facility had been in contact with my uncle for several weeks attempting to resolve the balance, and when it was not resolved, they were legally required to discharge her. The outstanding balance was $14,400. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked about my grandmother's personal account. Every resident at Sunrise Ridge has a small personal account that family can fund for incidentals, toiletries, snacks, activities. My grandmother's had been funded with $500 when she moved in and regularly topped up after that. The balance was $3. I thanked Carolyn for her time. I told her I was going to need copies of everything. All account statements, all correspondence with my uncle, the discharge paperwork, all of it. She said she'd have it ready for me. Then I called my uncle. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. I had expected voicemail. I had prepared myself for voicemail. "Hey, Simone," he said, like it was a normal Tuesday, like he hadn't had his mother discharged from a memory care facility and dropped on a street corner in 22-degree weather that morning. I have thought a lot about how I handled that phone call. I am a person who tends to go quiet when I'm angry. Not cold exactly, just very still and very careful. I did not yell. I didn't cry. I asked him one question. "Where did you think she was going?" He said he thought the car service driver would help her to the door. He said he'd given the driver my apartment number. I told him I had found her 4 blocks away, standing on a corner in her slippers. He said, "Oh?" That was it. Just oh. I told him I was going to need to understand what had happened with her finances. I told him I had just learned the facility had 2 months of unpaid bills and that her personal account was nearly empty. I told him her pension and Social Security should have been more than covering the monthly cost, and I needed to know where that money was going. He said the finances were complicated. He said he'd been going through some things. He said he'd intended to sort it out. I said I would be in touch. And then I hung up, because I had already decided that this phone call was evidence, and I was going to need to be very deliberate about what I did next. I have to tell you something about who I am, because it's relevant to what happened over the following weeks. I was 31 years old at that point. I had been a registered nurse for 3 years. I had spent those 3 years in an oncology unit, which means I had spent 3 years learning how to read paperwork very carefully, how to document everything, and how to navigate institutions and systems on behalf of people who don't have the capacity or the energy to do it for themselves. I was also, since the age of about 16, the person in my family who kept records, birthday lists, phone numbers, medical histories. My grandmother used to joke that I was the family's human filing cabinet. They had no idea how useful that was about to become. The first thing I did was call Adult Protective Services. I know some people's instinct would be to call the police, and I want to address that directly because several people have asked me about this. The reason I didn't call 911 first is that what had happened that morning, being discharged from a care facility, was not itself a crime in the same way that a physical assault would be. What I suspected was happening with the finances was a serious crime, but I needed documentation before law enforcement could do much with it. APS could conduct an investigation, compel the release of financial records, and document the elder abuse independently. That gave me a parallel track while I gathered my own evidence. I called both. Actually, I filed an APS report that morning and called the non-emergency police line to document the incident. Both have case numbers. The second thing I did was call an elder law attorney. I found her through the Ohio State Bar Association's referral service. Her name is not important, but she was one of the sharpest people I've ever sat across a table from, and she charged $275 an hour, which I paid out of my own savings account because I had no other choice. She asked me what I had. I told her about the discharge, the missing payments, the power of attorney, the phone call I had recorded, which I should note is legal in Ohio as long as one party to the call consents, and I was that party. She asked if I had any access to my grandmother's financial accounts. I didn't, but I told her I knew things. I knew which bank my grandmother had used for 30 years. I knew the approximate balance of her savings as of about 2 years ago. I knew her pension came from the state teachers' retirement system of Ohio. I knew her Social Security deposit day. My attorney told me we were going to petition the court to remove my uncle as power of attorney and appoint a professional guardian for my grandmother. In cases of suspected financial exploitation, Ohio courts can move relatively quickly, especially when there is a vulnerable adult who is not safely housed. My grandmother was technically living with me at that point, but I did not have the legal authority to make decisions about her care. My uncle still did, and that needed to change immediately. The petition was filed within the week. While we waited for the court date, I was also, quietly, building the picture of what had actually happened. My uncle had been given power of attorney in June, about 5 weeks after my grandmother moved into Sunrise Ridge. He had gone to visit her, something he did infrequently, and he had apparently convinced her to sign documents. I say apparently because my grandmother, even in the early stages of her disease, was someone who trusted her children completely. She would have signed whatever he put in front of her if he told her it was important. What the POA gave him was control over her finances. Her pension checks, which were direct deposited into her account, were redirected within 2 months. Her Social Security was redirected shortly after. Her savings account, the $90,000 just-in-case fund, had been accessed repeatedly over the following 8 months. By the time I obtained the bank records through the legal process, the balance was $4,212. That's not accounting fees. That's not a misunderstanding about how to manage someone's finances. Over $85,000 was gone, transferred in amounts that were small enough to avoid automatic flags, but large enough to add up very fast, into an account that was not my grandmother's and was not a facility account. My uncle, I learned, had been unemployed for about 14 months. His wife had filed for divorce. He had credit card debt in excess of $60,000. He had what is generously described as a complicated relationship with money, and what is more accurately described as a pattern of financial behavior that had been a problem for a long time but had always been someone else's problem to absorb. This time the someone else was his 81-year-old mother with Alzheimer's. The court date was set for 6 weeks after we filed the petition. In that 6 weeks, 3 things happened. The first thing was that my uncle called me. Twice. The first call, he was conciliatory. He said he had meant to pay the facility back. He said he'd been borrowing, not stealing, and he intended to repay every cent. I said very little and I recorded both calls. The second call was less conciliatory. He said I was tearing the family apart. He said our grandmother would be devastated to know what I was doing. He said blood was blood, and you don't drag family into court. I still said very little. I was very good at saying very little by then. I had learned in those weeks that every time I let him talk, he gave me something. The second thing that happened was that my mother, my grandmother's daughter, my uncle's sister, called me and asked me to drop the case. I want to be careful here because my mother is a complicated topic. She loves my grandmother. I believe that completely. But she is also someone who has spent her entire life smoothing things over, keeping the peace, absorbing the cost of keeping everyone in the same room together. She calls me and said that my uncle was going through a hard time and that he was going to pay it back, and that dragging this through the courts was going to cause damage that couldn't be undone. I told her I heard her. I told her I was not going to drop the case. I told her that her mother had been left on a street corner in 22 degrees with nothing but a plastic bag and her house slippers, and that I was not willing to be the person who decided that was something we just moved past. She didn't speak to me for about 3 weeks after that. That was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. The third thing that happened in those 6 weeks was that I moved my grandmother's things into my apartment properly. I bought a bed. I rearranged my second bedroom. I learned which TV shows she liked and what temperature she needed the apartment to be. I learned that she slept better with a small lamp on in the hallway. I learned that on good days, she remembered teaching and would talk for an hour about specific students. And on harder days, she was quiet and a little afraid. And what she needed most on those days was just someone to sit near her without demanding anything. I fell deeply, completely in love with being the person who knew those things. The court date came on a Thursday in late March. I took the day off work. My attorney had assembled the financial records, the bank statements, the APS report, the police report, the discharge documentation, the recorded phone calls. My uncle arrived with his own attorney, a man who seemed to be attempting to argue that this was a family financial matter that had gotten out of hand and didn't require court intervention. The judge disagreed. She was not loud about it. She was very quiet about it, actually, which in my experience is often worse. She reviewed the financial records. She reviewed the timeline. She listened to excerpts from the phone calls. She asked my uncle's attorney exactly twice to clarify certain figures, and both times the answers were not satisfying. At the end of the hearing, the judge removed my uncle as power of attorney. She appointed a professional fiduciary, a court-certified guardian, to manage my grandmother's finances going forward. She ordered a full financial accounting, which means my uncle had to document where every dollar had gone. She referred the case to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal charges. I did not celebrate in the courthouse. I sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes by myself. Then I called my attorney to talk through next steps, and then I drove home. My grandmother was with a neighbor I trusted, a woman in her 60s who had 3 grandchildren and a very calm personality and who had been keeping my grandmother company on the days I worked, since we'd made this arrangement work. When I came home, my grandmother was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she looked up at me when I walked in. And that day was a good day, a clear day. And she said, "There's my girl." I had to go into the bathroom for a minute after that. The criminal referral is ongoing. I can't speak to the specifics because it's an active process, but I can say that financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult in Ohio is a serious charge. The fiduciary's accounting found that $86,400 had been diverted from my grandmother's accounts over an 8-month period. The facility debt of $14,400 has been documented as part of that. We are pursuing a civil claim in addition to the criminal referral, which my attorney believes has a strong basis. My uncle has not contacted me since the court date. My mother came over about a month after the hearing. She brought flowers, which is what she does when she doesn't know how to start a conversation. She sat at my kitchen table and she cried. And she said she was sorry, and she said she'd known for a while that something was wrong with her brother, but she hadn't known it had gotten this bad. I believe her. I also know that believing her doesn't require me to pretend the past few months didn't happen, and I told her that we are figuring out what our relationship looks like going forward. That's the most honest thing I can say about it. My grandmother has good days and harder days, the way she always has. We have a morning routine now. I make her oatmeal and she tells me about the weather, because she always has an opinion about the weather. On Sundays, we watch the news together, and she tells me what she thinks about things, and her opinions are still sharp even when her memory isn't, which I find wonderful and a little heartbreaking in equal measure. Her church sends people over sometimes to visit, women she's known for decades, and those afternoons are the best ones. She will not be going back to a facility. I know that's not a decision that works for every family, and I know my situation. A nurse, living alone, with a flexible enough schedule to make this work, is not everyone's situation. But it's my situation, and this is my choice. And every day I'm more sure it's the right one. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled things. If I wish I'd tried harder to keep it quiet, keep it in the family, give my uncle a chance to fix it himself. I think about the corner of Meridian in Callaway at 6:47 in the morning. 22 degrees. House slippers. A plastic bag. She said she didn't want to be a burden. She had $90,000 that she'd saved over 30 years. Money she was supposed to use for exactly this kind of moment, and someone took it from her. And then left her on a street corner because there was nothing left to take. No. I don't regret a single thing.